want to go to my guest, though. I am joined by the man himself, KJ No. He is a great friend of the show. I always enjoy talking to him. I love what comes out of his mouth. KJ is a journalist, political analyst, and writer and teacher specializing in the geopolitiks of the Asia Pacific region. He was a contributor to the book Capitalism on a Ventilator, once censored by Amazon. It is now available at iacenter.org. And one more thing, KJ, where can people find you? I'm starting this first because I realize that if people don't stay to the very end of the interview, or if I break the interview up, did they miss that part? Where can people find you, KJ?
They can find me on the Breakthrough News Network. I co-host a show called The China Report.
Excellent. And look, KJ, people have loved you when you've come on this show. They've enjoyed the commentary, the content, the point of view that you espouse. And so, look, I want to thank you for being one of my guests on these issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
I have to start at South Korea. You sent me a link and you pointed out U.S. elites want South Korea to be a dictatorship for democracy. I love that. Dictatorship for democracy. Go into that. Explain what you mean by that.
Yes. I mean, it's not something that I made up. It's actually what a high-ranking former U.S. Official has said. This is Morse Tan. He was a former ambassador at large for the U.S. State Department. And for those of you who don't know what an ambassador at large is, it's almost like a viceroy in the U.S. State Department. You know, people like Averell Harriman, Henry Cabot Lodge, Paul Nitze, Paul Bremer, Strobe Talbot, you know, these kinds of people. So they're really, really powerful diplomats in the State Department. And he was recently in Korea at a rally, and he said, President Yoon, this is the South Korean president who recently declared martial law. He said that Yoon declared martial law to preserve South Korea's democracy. In other words, he's saying that Yoon made himself military dictator because he was going to preserve democracy. Okay, so this is kind of absurd, but what I'm trying to say is that this is the kind of discourse that's coming out of Washington. This is what they're either saying explicitly through people like Morse Tan, you know, who's a former official, but this is likely what they're thinking amongst themselves. And Tan also, what he said is that, so Yoon Suk-yeol has been charged with insurrection. Why? Because he tried to overthrow the constitutional order of South Korea. Why? Because in the middle of the night when people were going to bed, he suddenly, out of the blue, declared that the country was a military dictatorship, that he was declaring martial law. And he's on television saying this, and then he sent troops to prevent the lawmakers from voting it down. And there's sworn testimony that says that he told troops to shoot the lawmakers inside the parliament to prevent them from voting it down. So this is clearly something terribly illegal, and it is what the Koreans would call insurrection. It's treason, and therefore he's been charged with treason. But again, Morse Tan has said that the impeachment of Yoon Suk-yeol is an insurrection. And he says that it's led by the opposition party, Lee Jae-myung, who wants to turn the country over to Chinese communists. And so this is the level of absurdity that you're hearing on the South Korean right wing. But note that these talking points are being echoed by a very, very high-ranking U.S. Former State Department official. And so that gives you a sense of the way in which U.S. interests and South Korean right-wing interests are merging, but also the way in which U.S. interests are probably driving South Korea's protests.
You know what's ironic about this, KJ, is that they say the same thing about Trump in Russia, effectively saying, Witkoff is clearly a Putin agent, and he's working for Putin. And he's meaning there's an ironic parallel in the things that people say about the Trump administration trying to get a deal with Russia, and this idea of, okay, well, these guys going in democracy and impeaching a president that tried to declare martial law, well, obviously those people are working with the Chinese. It's like, okay, dude, not everything that is taking place purely because of your opponent. And it's just very bizarre in the way that this is breaking down. It's the same administration, but in one sense, the administration is being seen as, okay, well, you're clearly working for Putin and an agent of Putin. By the same token, that same administration that is being accused as being an agent of Putin is now accusing another government of being an agent of China. That is like, it's amazing how both of these things are coming out of the same government or being directed at the same government. What is going on with his case? He was let out of prison, but he's still being investigated. And maybe and let's break this up into two different ways. One, let's break it up into, okay, the US wants this guy in power in some way because they were backing a dictatorship, because they believed that dictatorship, A, was going to either provoke a war with North Korea or have it to be a pivot point to be working in against Chinese interests. That seems to be where all of this is being placed. The US and its Asian pivot, and South Korea being one of the major countries that it has in mind for the Asia pivot. But doesn't it mean on some level that if you had to declare a dictatorship, that they didn't trust the government of South Korea? Because I guess on some level, ostensibly, it's a democracy.
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing to know about South Korea that it was a military dictatorship or a fascist dictatorship for about half of its existence. It was created. South Korea was created by the United States. You know, the way that South Vietnam was created. It's an artificial construct. And it was created specifically to prevent Korea from going socialist. You see, after 1945, until 1945, Korea was a Japanese colony. After the Japanese lost, the Koreans built for themselves something called the Korean People's Republic, which was indigenous. Let me emphasize that point. It was an indigenous socialist state that was constituted out of 30,000 worker and peasant collectives. So they just, the moment the Japanese were out there, they went socialist because that was the way that the entire country had been trending. I mean, the people who fought the Japanese were socialists, you know. So when that happened, the US realized we cannot let this happen. So, you know, with Russia taking, trusteeship of the North, the US came into the trusteeship in the South. And in the South, they banned all the labor unions, they banned all the peasant collectives, they banned all the worker collectives. And then they said that, we are going to put in our own little fascist, which they did. This guy was called Syngman Rhee, and he started a genocide, and he wiped out all of those, socialists. I mean, we estimate somewhere in the range from 300,000 to 1.2 million were killed. This is like Indonesia, what happened in Indonesia. And this was what was happening before the Korean War started. So you have to understand South Korea was created by the US as a bulwark against indigenous socialism, and it was implemented through genocide, literal genocide. The longest mass grave in the world is in South Korea. It's 3 kilometers long, and they have 150 mass graves that have not been excavated. So this is a part of the history that people don't understand. It was literally created by genocide by the United States that wanted a bulwark against the spread of socialism in Asia. So having said that, it has been a series of dictatorships, and it did not have an elected civilian government until 1993 under Kim Jong-sam. Before then, it was, fascist U.S. Puppet, fascist U.S. puppet, fascist U.S. puppet, and most of them were generals.
Mm-hmm.
And then,
yeah, but democracy sticks sometimes.
Yeah, exactly. So the easiest configuration for the United States has always been to have a military dictatorship in South Korea. I mean, that's the thing that has been the most convenient for them. And these military dictatorships rendered so many favors for the United States. So, for example, during the Vietnam War, as the US was starting and proceeding with and losing the war, South Korea sent 340,000 troops to Vietnam. 340,000. They were the second largest deployment after the US itself. And after 1972, South Korean troops outnumbered American troops in Vietnam 2-1. And so you can see how convenient this quizzling is. But currently, South Korea has 3.6 million troops. That's the size of South Korea's military. It has 500,000 regular troops, incredibly trained, ready to go to war in an eye blink. It's that line that the Wolfpack has. They say, "We fight tonight." They're ready to start war immediately. And then you have another 3.1 million reserve troops that can be pulled up, at the drop of a switch. And that makes South Korea have the third largest military manpower in the world. It is larger than China and Russia combined. Okay. So this is the incredible force multiplier, force projection platform. And the thing to understand here is that South Korea's military falls under US operational control the moment the United States declares it. If they declare the magic words DEFCON 3, that means that the US gets all of South Korea's troops, all of South Korea's bases, all of South Korea's material and weapons. They all fall under the control of the United Forces Korea 4-star general. Okay, so that's the setup.
Just the intrude for a bit. I get the sense, though, that because South Korea may have a veto on that, meaning if you have a strongman in, if you have let's say a Quisling leader, okay, well, they send those troops. There's no question. Hell, those troops may even go to Ukraine, especially with this argument, oh, the North Korean troops in Ukraine, they just burned their faces just before death because, hashtag reasons. Okay, we have not seen that, but the very language of it, on some level, language dictates the context to which you function and operate. And so by them saying, oh, they're North Korean troops, okay, obviously, if they can get their hands on South Korea, especially in a losing war, they may want to send those South Korean troops into the breach. There's that. Two, they may not trust South Korea under the government to which they have. Like, it's one thing when it's under a military dictatorship. It's a dictatorship. You do whatever you want. That is not the same thing, though, as having, let's say, a South Korean government that may question, okay, well, maybe we don't want to send our troops to Ukraine. Maybe we don't want to start a war with North Korea. Maybe we don't think China is this threat that you're effectively saying that China is, which breeds a certain amount of distrust in this idea of South Korea sending those 3 million troops. Does it make sense? Like, the issue that they may have is that they don't know that South Korea would actually do what they tell South Korea to do because they have a democratic government. And democratic governments are very difficult to work with because they are a multiple of people and they may come up with a different assessment. Iran, really good example. When the US and Britain, when Iran started to say back in the 70s, I believe, yeah, maybe we need to use more of the money for our oil for our own domestic consumption. We have all this oil. We may make the lives of people in the country better. And the US and Britain were like, okay, that's a problem. They're coming up with ideas. Let's get rid of that government, in which case they put in their own dictator. So is that what we're looking at? That really a lot of this stuff boils down to the US is making an major pivot and they don't trust a South Korean government that may come up with a different assessment. And if you push it, may change the model to which they have operated for all of these years as being a quisling of the United States.
You're absolutely right. That is what was going on. So, once again, Barack Obama declared the pivot to Asia. The pivot to Asia, in its, clearest terms, was essentially a declaration of war against China. It was a plan to encircle China with bases, to choke it out, They drafted a plan of war called Air Sea Battle, literally a plan of war, a doctrine of war. And then they also had a plan of economic warfare called the Trans Pacific Partnership. All of these things have been continued in one way or another, have been ratcheted up and escalated. So the plan since at least 2011 and really 2008, 2009 is essentially to escalate to war with China in order to make sure that the US system, the global hegemonic system, where the US is the apex predator and sucks all the wealth out of the rest of the global South, as Pete Hegseth put it very nakedly, that system does not change, that nobody gets to run off the farm. Nobody gets to run off the plantation the way that China did. Everybody has to stay on the plantation with the US as the overseer and the controller of this entire global system, what they call full spectrum dominance and unipolar hegemony. Because China broke that mold, that's why the Obama administration decided that they had to go to war against China. So these plans have been building for over a decade. Now, the important piece again is South Korea is one of the key force projection platforms against China. As I said, it's because it has 3.6 million troops that fall on the drop of a hat under US control. It has the fifth most powerful military in the world, and it's right next to China. It's literally the on-ramp onto the Chinese continent. For 500 years, all seaborne invasions of China have started either from the Korean Peninsula or from Taiwan Island, and usually the two come in matched pairs, the two at the same time. And so Korea is incredibly important, but not simply Korea by itself, but the US created something called JACAS, the Japan Korea US Alliance. They turned them into this like tripartite military alliance, which is unthinkable. Remember, Japan colonized Korea for almost half a century. I mean, as far as the South Koreans are concerned, Japan is like Nazi Germany, cubed. It's just unthinkable to
Comfort
go.
women, if you
Yeah,
remember. Like, what's his name? That goofball YouTuber, that
yes,
IRL streamer that is stuck in South Korea now, that was
yeah,
dancing with the comfort women that created that international incident where
yeah.
he's effectively stuck there and is going to be prosecuted. The comfort woman was directly from that war.
Exactly, exactly. That's what 200,000, 400,000
Yep.
women taken into sexual slavery to serve Japanese
Yep.
troops. And, according to scholars, three-fourths of those women died during their enslavement. That's a death rate which is higher than frontline soldiers. Okay,
Wow.
so that gives you a sense of the kind of you know uh, history between Japan and Korea. But Yoon comes from a line of politicians that were Japanese collaborators during during the colonization of Japan, of Korea. You see the same thing in Taiwan. There's a stream of politicians. Their families were collaborators with the Japanese. Taiwan was also a Japanese colony. Uh, uh, in fact, the Chinese tried to prevent the Japanese from colonizing Korea. This is called the Sino-Japanese War. The Chinese lost this war, and as a result of this, the Japanese took Taiwan as war booty from that war, and that was also the beginning of the colonization of Korea. So
Wow.
coming back to bad blood, you have the comfort women. This is another thing that people don't understand. It wasn't just the comfort women; it was slave labor in general. The Japanese put millions of Koreans and took them into slave labor. They were taken to Japan as slave laborers. That's why when the atomic bomb went off in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, about 30% of the people killed were Koreans. What were the Koreans doing in Hiroshima and Nagasaki? Well, they were working in the factories. They were slave labor. They were all killed and then or injured. And then after the bombing, Japan surrendered, and it said, the Koreans, they're illegal aliens, and we're not going to treat them. And so you had, tens of thousands of Koreans who died because they couldn't get any medical treatment. So, the crimes just go on and on. I'm not exaggerating when I say that for Koreans and for most of Asians, the Japanese are the Nazis cubed. It's just they're Nazis on steroids. They took millions of Koreans and Japanese, sorry, millions of Koreans and Chinese to Manchuria, to northern China. They worked them to death in these slave camps, and historians refer to this as the Manchurian Passage, because the death rates were comparable or even higher to the transatlantic slave trade. People compare it to the Belgian Congo, the number of Koreans and Chinese who were killed, because this is how Japan became big and powerful. It's the same reason why the U.S. became big and powerful. It's the same reason why Portugal and the U.K. became big and powerful. It became big and powerful not simply because it had colonies, but it had colonies with slave labor. Okay, so that is the history between Korea and Japan. And Yoon has suddenly decided, on the prompting of the United States, that South Korea is going to create a military alliance with its former colonizer. It's like being forced to marry a rapist, right? It's something that's unthinkable for the vast majority of Koreans. That history is still living memory. It wasn't so far along that the Japanese actually colonized Korea. I speak a little bit of Japanese. Why? Because my parents spoke Japanese. Why? Because everybody in Korea under Japanese colonization was forced to speak Japanese and take on a Japanese name. So this is not old history. It's not ancient history.
Would the South Koreans do? And by the way, for people who want some kind of, I guess, background on Belgium and the Congo, King Leopold's Soliloquy by Mark Twain. Oh, it is fantastic. It is. It is a disturbing book because the entire book is King Leopold justifying enslavement of the Congo and a number of people being killed. Like at one point in the book, he's like, "Yeah, I understand that all of these, let's say 1 million people died over the course of, or the population declined by 25% in a few years, but we had to get the rubber." So, like it's a wild book in the way that it's explaining it, but it is gruesome. And I guess my point is, if you're looking for a background to your point on this, that book would be it. Is South Korea okay with that? Meaning, is the South Korean population and the way that it's organized, are they on board for joining this military alliance that the US and Europe wants to set up against China?
No, not 1 ounce. As I said, it's like being forced to marry your
You're right.
rapist. It's unthinkable. And the fact that Yoon entered into this military alliance with Japan, with the rising sun flying on Korean soil or in Korean territorial waters, that is just unthinkable. And so that's why so many people were so opposed to Yoon. They were out in the streets just before he declared martial law. There were 100,000 people in the streets demanding his immediate resignation. But Yoon was determined to stay in power, and the US wanted Yoon in power because they need him to maintain this tripartite alliance, because they want him to be the kind of quisling or the subcontractor for US war against China. This escalation is very real. It's very concrete. There's a granularity to the military exercises. If you've been in the military, you say this is not normal. You do not rehearse on this level unless you're preparing for it. Remember, just recently, a few weeks ago, there were 30 something people or 50 something, at least 31 people were injured when South Korean troops engaging in a US South Korean military drill bombed their own village, right? 152 houses were destroyed. This was a live, fire bombing that the U.S. was conducting with South Koreans, doing the actual bombing rehearsal. And it's realistic because, when you have a war, probably somewhere between 5 and 25% of all casualties are friendly fire casualties. So this is literally rehearsal for war. So they had a friendly fire incident because they were some live fire bombing of North Korea right near the border, and the coordinates were entered wrong according to them, and they ended up bombing a church and destroying 152 houses in a village in South Korea. So, I mean, this is all to say it's very, very close. It's escalating to war. And the US wants to make sure that Yoon Suk-yeol, or at least a quisling comparable to him, stays in power so that they can continue this US South Korea Japan alliance and continue to Ukrainize the country so it can escalate to war and be the US proxy in Northeast Asia. So when Yoon declared martial law, you have to understand that he didn't simply declare martial. He'd been planning this for months. But when he did it, he had prepared to trigger a war with North Korea. They had been firing missiles and shells into disputed territory near the northern limit line. They had sent drones right towards Pyongyang. They had given orders. They were flying helicopters right up. These are high flying helicopters. You never fly helicopters that high, but they were flying, Black Hawk helicopters right up against the northern limit line, high up, in the hopes that it would draw fire. And of course, I think I told you this before, when Yoon Suk-yeol declared martial law, he also had plans, according to, his subordinates, he had plans to kill off, a large number of his opponents and then to blame it on North Korea. So this was martial law plus a false flag attack.
Do you think? Okay, so there are two thoughts.
Mm-hmm.
In one sense, that because South Korea has been a dictatorship for so long, I will tell you, in the West, most of us don't remember the Korean War. I mean, the Korean War. And we remember, from our point of view, North Korea and South Korea, forgetting the fact that there was a Korea and that there was a war that decided that this is going to be North and South. That may not be true, however, for people in the US that are war planners, and they may think to themselves, okay, well, this used to be a dictatorship. Let's just go back to dictatorship. Missing the point that the people didn't want to be in a dictatorship, right? And so those people effectively came out and said, no, this is not something that we actively want, which ironically may make their point about why they were trying to make it a dictatorship, because they can't necessarily control it now that they've had a taste of democracy. And they were like, hey, we're supposed to control our affairs. What do you mean you want to be a dictatorship? So there's this kind of odd dynamic of, okay, well, there used to be a dictatorship. What's the big deal in going back to that? It suits our best interests. Let's go that route. And the country saying no. Also, in the upcoming elections, that party, Yoon's party, is going to lose miserably. I would imagine, considering that this stuff has been aired. And just because we don't know it here doesn't mean they're not talking about it in South Korea, about what Yoon was trying to do, what he wanted to do, what the implications were of him doing that. And even whispers of, hey, was there somebody else pushing this guy to do that? All of that stuff works against US, or let's say foreign power interests in regards to getting South Korea in a mindset for war against China. The second part to that, that stuff was taking place under the Biden administration. Correct me if I'm wrong. I think Trump wants, let's say, maybe competition with China. I don't know if he wants war with China. But you tell me, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm being deluded by this notion of, okay, well, we'll lose that war, or at the very least the world will lose that war. There's no way to win it. Why would they have it? Give me your take on that. I don't get the sense that Donald Trump wants a great power war. In fact, I go further. The entire point of Donald Trump breaking the world up into spheres of influence on some level gets across that the US is not a hegemon in the way that it was, let's say, in the 1990s or 2000s. And that admittance, that experiential admittance, hints that China has its own sphere of influence. Europe, or let's say Russia, has its own sphere of influence. America has its own sphere of influence, which means we don't necessarily want a war. We do want to exert some level of control into what we consider a sphere of influence, and we do want to have a great power conflict in an economic sense in regards to some kind of tariff war as we divide up the world and figure out what the world looks like going forward. Give me your take on that. Do you disagree with that? And if so, why?
I don't have a good answer, Jamal, because it's very complex. People kind of break down US policy. It's simplistic, but they say, they're primacists and they're restrainers, and then they're prioritizers. Restrainers, just want to kind of, tend our own garden. Prioritizers want to prioritize China. They want to pivot to China and drop Ukraine. And then there are primacists like the Biden, Obama administration that want global hegemony. These are the, total neocons. What is the Trump administration's policy? It's unclear because they're mixed messages. You have people like Hegseth, you have people like Rubio. These people are primacists. They look like primacists, and they are clearly anti-China. And they've spoken clearly and explicitly about having a division of labor so that they can go after China. Europe takes care of Russia, continues to bleed it out, and we will go after China. They're on record saying this explicitly. At the same time, Trump is a businessman, and I think you can make the argument that he wants to do business. He's transactional, but he wants to do business. And I've said that Trump is not anti-war, but he is against losing wars. And I think he's smart enough to know that starting a war with China would be an immediate losing proposition. There is no way you can win a war with China unless you go nuclear and go nuclear really fast. And so I don't think that is on Trump's, dance card, but I don't know about the other people who, some of them are apocalyptic religious warriors. I mean, certainly, I think, Hegseth, seems to be in this crusader mindset. And there's a kind of eschatological, apocalyptic ideology that also drives them, that wants never to give up US primacy. So that is kind of an ongoing question. And then the other point that I'll make, and, I'm going to make it, I'm not going to, make everybody's day, but, capitalism has been in crisis at least since the 1970s. And it's, been contorting itself left, right, and other, trying to create new markets and new models. But it's continually broken down. In 2008, the ruling class kind of gave up the ghost. They said capitalism is finished. This was Nicolas Sarkozy, and he said it's finished. We can't do anything more with it. But there is always something that capitalism does, and that is that it uses war to reset the economy. It's like, if you think of capitalism as your like obese uncle, who just can't control their appetite, they're just greedy, they can't stop eating, and then they have a heart attack, right? And so then you have to administer, CPR. Well, the wall defibrillator that you use on your obese uncle, that wall defibrillator for capitalism is called war. And so this is how you, jumpstart and get the zombie running again. And so, war could be part of this, larger, structural logic. But let me go back to Yoon Suk-yeol, because you made a very good point, and it ties to whether war is possible or not. If the US does go to war with China, it will use proxies. It will use proxies, Japan, Korea with its 3.6 million troops. It will use Taiwan Island. It will use the Philippines. It will use every little proxy that it can draw up, including, a kind of Asian NATO, AUKUS, Australia. So, but Yoon, because of this gambit, this very, very high stakes gambit where he tried to make himself dictator, and this, wasn't successful, he was put into prison. They released him from prison, which is a very bad sign. Okay, they released him on a technicality. It took them, almost a month to kind of overcome his armed guards and take him into custody. And then the court said, oh, there's a technicality, you didn't calculate his time right, etc., etc. Just a minor technicality. They released him from prison. Right now he's back in his bunker in the presidential, residence, surrounded by not merely armed guards, but armored weaponry, right? They have armored tanks and things like that in that compound. So he's back ensconced in his seat of power. The prosecution refused to appeal his release, which tells you how serious the prosecution is about prosecuting him. He used to be a former prosecutor. He was the prosecutor general. So that's actually his little army. Okay. And and so but he has so thoroughly discredited himself. I think you're right that it's not likely that his party will win. Uh, so this is a problem because the U.S. when they had Yoon, it was like Christmas in Washington. It was early Christmas. It was champagne corks exploded. They called him our perfect partner. He was a walking wish fulfillment list. And Rahm Emanuel, Japanese ambassador, said, it's just a matter of institutionalizing what Yoon has put into place, all these belligerent escalations and the tripartite alliance, etc. And now that Yoon has thoroughly discredited himself and looks that there is a chance of him being impeached, and if he's impeached, there are 60 days for a new presidential election. And if that new presidential election happens, it will go to the opposition party chief, who is Lee Jae-myung. Lee Jae-myung ran against Yoon Suk-yeol, at a few years ago, and he almost beat Yoon Suk-yeol. And he hasn't gone away. And if there is a snap election, he will be the top candidate. He's 20 points higher than any other candidate who could run for presidency. And that snap election would go to the opposition. Now, guess what Lee Jae-myung's policy on China is?
Considering the reaction, I would imagine, meaning considering the reaction of we're taking over the government because the opposition is friends with China, I would imagine he has less hawkish policy towards China.
Yeah, he wants some modus vivendi. He wants to balance between China and the U.S.
And he should.
China's not going away. He wants good relations with China, and also he's not a total American quisling.
Yeah.
He's not a complete puppet. Why? Let me tell you something about his life history. Okay, so the period that he was growing up, South Korea was very, very poor. Okay, and I know this because I lived through Korea during that period. When I was going to middle school, every year my classmates would drop out of school. Why would they drop out? Because they couldn't afford the tuition. Right? How much was that tuition? It was about $10 every 3 months. They could not afford that. They could not afford $3 tuition a month. Okay, so they would drop out of school, and what would they do? They would go and start to work in factories. Now, if you're 12, 13, 14, and you start working in a factory, your life is essentially, pardon my French, fucked. Your life is over. It's like going into a brothel or a whorehouse. You're not going to come back from that.
Yeah.
And
Wow.
Lee Jae-myung is one of these people. He's when he was, I think, 12 or 11, he started working in a factory. Okay, started working in a sweatshop. And he spent his whole life working in sweatshops. If you look at him on video, you'll see that he doesn't use one of his arms. Why? Because his arm was mangled twice in machinery when he was working as a kid, working in a rubber factory, a plastic, manufacturing. I mean, these are small, these are small sweatshops. There's no safety, there's no lighting. The floor is slippery, and his arm was mangled twice, so he actually cannot use one of his arms. But and so this is what sets him aside, is that even while he was working at a sweatshop, he studied. He took he attended a night school after working, a 12, 14-hour day. Went to a
Mhm.
night school, and then he took the high school equivalency test, and he was accepted into law school. And then in law school, he aced his studies, and then he passed the bar, and he aced the bar. So he's not your average sweatshop worker who,
Yeah.
most of them are dead by the age of 40 from cancer or, industrial accidents. So from that point, he became, a lawyer, kind of a labor lawyer, human rights lawyer, and then he ran for office, and then he became the mayor of a major city, and so on and so on. So he worked his way up the political ladder, but there's a very, very strong populist bent, if you will, simply because of his own, life experience.
Mhm. Yeah, it's hard to ignore that life experience. I mean,
And
especially, oh man, wow. Yeah, I didn't know that. I
yeah,
mean, that's a
no,
hell of a difference.
nobody tells you that. And then you think about Yun Seo-gyal. This was a guy, descendant of Japanese collaborators, born with a silver spoon in his mouth, went to the top, prep schools, went to the top university, played his way through, his studies. Apparently, he's an incredibly great a pool player. He's something of a pool shark, so where he's been putting his energy into. And and then he failed the bar exam 9 times. Okay. Failed.
Wait, did you
Yeah.
say nine, nine
Yes.
times?
8 or 9 times, but he just took the bar exam over and over and over again until finally he passed it. Okay, so we're looking at two very different people, Lee Jae-myung versus Yoon Suk-yeol. uh, Silver spoon, every privilege, and still an academic dunce. Okay. Then he became a prosecutor, and then he moved his way up, but he never had political office, and he never won an election in his life. All of a sudden, out of the blue, he wins the presidential election. Everybody's astonished. How did that happen? Well, there's a great deal of suspicion that whatever boosted him to the top were the people who benefited from boosting him to the top, which is the U.S. deep state. They wanted him. They gave him a spread on Foreign Affairs magazine. He said that I'll do everything you want me to do, and lo and behold, the next day he is the president of South Korea. So the US wants Yoon Suk-yeol. They certainly do not want somebody like Lee Jae-myung. They want to make sure, absolutely, that nobody like Lee Jae-myung is anywhere near the presidency. Someone who's populist, who believes in the working
Mhm.
class, who is friendly with China, and who might push back against US influence. They don't want anybody like that. Okay. So now get this. This is what's happening right now. Yoon Suk-yeol has his trial in the Constitutional Court is finished, and the
Mhm.
Constitutional Court is supposed to deliver a verdict on his impeachment, either uphold it or reject it. But they have to deliver that verdict fast, because it has already been 30 days since the trial has ended, and they've been endlessly hanging fire, and everybody's out in the streets wondering, what the hell? Why is the Constitutional Court not delivering its verdict? It's easy. This is an open and shut case. It's not like a corruption case where you have to find the evidence. He's on television declaring martial law. The evidence is right there. Did he send troops to prevent the legislators from voting it down? Yes, we have footage of the troops. We have footage of people fighting the troops, you know. And then there's all this testimony that says that, he told us to shoot the legislators. And there's other testimony that says that, he was trying to trigger a war with Korea. So this is, clearly impeachable.
Yeah.
But the constitutional is taking its good time, and the question is why, right? Well, this is the other piece of the equation is Lee Jae-myung, after he lost the election to Yoon Suk-yeol, his house was raided 400 times by the prosecutor's office. Okay, raided, not
400 times.
400 times. They tore his place upside down 400 times. I mean, the guy was literally homeless, because every other day, they would, show up and, tear his house upside down. Okay. So finally, they found that he had done something that was illegal, that he had lied while he was campaigning, that he had told, this kind of like, little fib while he was campaigning. And because of that, the prosecution demanded that he be imprisoned. And he has received, a sentence of 1 year. Okay. Now, usually campaign, you fib on the campaign trail, in the US, it doesn't even register. It just,
No.
If you're lucky, it might affect your campaign, but usually doesn't register. And in Korea, if there is something like that, it's usually a small fine. It's about $800 fine. Okay, but the prosecution, remember, Yoon Suk-yeol used to be the prosecutor general. They tore him upside down and they asked for maximal punishment, and they got 1 year. They got a 1 year sentence. It's now being adjudicated in appeals, and the appellate court has to decide whether to uphold that sentence or not. If that sentence is upheld, and he has to serve time for it, then he is hit with a 10-year ban on political activity.
Oh, there it is. That's
Right?
why.
That's
That's why.
and there's been pressure for the Constitutional Court to delay its impeachment decision until Yoon's court case has been adjudicated by the appellate court, and this happens tomorrow, right?
CKJ, this is why people check out. Because that's so over, like, that's not even, grand chess. That is straightforward, right? We
Yeah.
need this guy to get jail time, so he is off the political circuit. By the way,
Yes.
they did the same thing with the Lula in Brazil. We need him in a cage. That guy's going to win. We need him in a cage. We need him to be off the political space so we have any chance to win. That is outrageous. And it is very shallow. Like, it is obvious that the guy is the number two. It is obvious that they're trying Gorgescu in Romania, same thing. They've raided the guy's place. They tried to put him in prison. They tried to put him in a cage. All of this is taking place in a country that's supposed to be a democracy. Like,
Yeah.
that's astonishing. Give me your
Let me ask you a question, Jamal.
please.
Who do you think is behind the delay of the release of the impeachment decision?
I would imagine it has to be some kind of ally
Yes.
of you.
A very high-powered ally, and according to a political, Korean assembly member, his name is Park Son-on, and he's very, very tightly connected to the intelligence services. He was actually He was in the National Security Council, and he says that the United States is exerting pressure through diplomatic channels to align the impeachment date as close to Lee Jae-myung's sentencing as possible. So this allegation is specifically being made, and he's hinted that it's the U.S. Ambassador himself, who has been, putting on this pressure. So, I mean, this is not a surprise, right? I mean, as you said, it's a global phenomenon. And it's like this, it's like, if you look in the night sky, sometimes you'll see Mars go retrograde or Mercury go retrograde. And if you have the notion that you are the center of your political motion, of that you are the center of political gravity, then those retrograde motions won't make any sense. But if you understand that there is a much, much more powerful gravitational force, namely the sun, around which all these other, planets circle, then those retrograde movements, those strange movements, start to make sense.
Hmm.
That center, that sun, that centrifugal force that guides all the other movements is the United States in Korea. The U.S.,
Yeah.
is the central gravitational force that determines, how these planetary bodies, political bodies, move. And when you see these strange movements, you just have to switch the focus and understand, oh, okay, that's what's happening. This is, that's the gravitational force that's working here.
You speaking astrology to me, KJ. Pluto, it's a planet I always look for in an astrological chart. Just saying. But you're right. The sun, the US is still this hegemon of sorts. Even if it's degrading, it's still there. It's still exerting influence. Fascinating. KJ, man, thank you for this. I always appreciate these conversations. My audience loves you to death. That last video that we did, they loved it. I mean, like through the moon comments saying, "Oh my God, we love KJ. KJ is fantastic." Thank you for this, KJ.
Thank you.
Fantastic explanation. KJ,
Always,
no.
always,
Oh, I'm sorry.
yeah, always a pleasure to be on your show, and always a pleasure to present to your listeners who are fantastic.
No, it's your explanations are logical, fantastic, and more in depth in a way that you would ever get out of typical mainstream media, who just glosses over much of the stuff. Like if you're looking at mainstream media, everybody's a villain, everybody's a bad guy. The U.S. is love and light. We just want justice around the world. We just believe in freedom. None of this stuff is true. Like this stuff is nonsense. Like the story that you pointed out about how we created um, a fascist state. Okay, most Americans don't know that. Like, and by the way, same thing in South America with the kill squads. Most Americans don't know that. The dictatorship we set up in Iran, most Americans don't know that. Like, it's fascinating to me how much our media effectively leaves out and glosses over in order to come up with this narrative. Just so the audience knows, KJ Noah is a journalist, political analyst, writer, and teacher specialized in the geopolitics of the Asia Pacific region. He's a contributor to the book Capitalism on a Ventilator. Once censored by Amazon, it is now available at IA Center. Also, KJ, where else can people find you, just so they know?
They can find me on the China Report, which is on YouTube, and that's part of the Breakthrough News Network.
Fantastic. Breakthrough News. What's his name is on that? Oh God, Eugene Perrier, right?
Absolutely.
Eugene used to work at the network. He's awesome. He's awesome. Thank you
Definitely.
for this, KJ. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
All